Dear audience, I'm very proud and honored to be one of the winners of the grant, and I would like to thank the organization for this very nice experience. And I'm pleased to present you the work that we performed in the Human Performance Lab of the Free University of Brussels with regard to cycling and recovery in the heat. What can the brain tell us? Obviously, when you exercise, there are some alterations of physiological parameters, and during the post-exercise recovery period, there is a normalization of physiological parameters, restoration of energy stores, and so forth. And when it's possible to accelerate the post-exercise recovery period, then this might beneficially influence subsequent exercise performance. And AR is active recovery, and active recovery is exercising at low to moderate intensity, and in literature it has been shown to accelerate blood lactate removal. However, in the heat it might sustain cardiovascular and thermoregulatory strain, and therefore it might be better to cool an athlete because then you rapidly reduce thermal load, core temperature, and other physiological parameters. And CWI is cold water immersion. It's a more aggressive form of cooling the athlete, and it's defined as immersing an athlete into water until the mid-sternum and the water temperature is set at a maximal of 15 degrees Celsius. Exercise and recovery not only influence physiological parameters, but there is also a psychological response. And one way to determine the effect of exercise and recovery is on higher brain functions is to determine the electrical activity within the brain. And the aims of this experiment in the heat was to determine the influence of different recovery interventions on physiological and performance parameters, to determine the impact of exercise and different recovery interventions on the electrical activity within the brain, and to identify the brain sources of altered electrocortical activity related to exercise and recovery. And therefore, 9 male trained subjects were included, and they had a relative VO2 max above 60. And our experiment started with a maximal cycle test, which was of importance to measure the VO2 max and the peak power output. And the peak power output was used during our experimental trial. And after the maximal cycle test, the subjects performed a familiarization trial and 3 experimental trials interspersed by 6 days of rest. Each experimental trial included 2 cycling bouts, and the first cycling bout was a 90-minute high-intensity cycling performance. This was immediately followed by a 15-minute recovery intervention and 45 minutes of rest. And the second cycling bout was a 12-minute time trial performance that started at 85% of the peak power output. And it's important to mention that during the time trials, time trial 1 and time trial 2, subjects were instructed to complete the time trial as fast as possible, and therefore they could alter the power output from the onset of the time trial. The recovery interventions that were applied were passive rest, cold water immersion, and active recovery. And to determine the effect of recovery on the subsequent time trial performance, we determined the pacing strategy, which is the distribution of the power output throughout the time trial, and therefore we segmented our time trial into 5% segments, and we compared the average power output with the starting resistance. To determine the effect of prolonged high-intensity cycling on brain functioning, we used EEG datasets at baseline and during the first 33% of the passive rest period. To determine the effect of the different recovery interventions on brain functioning, we used the first and last 33% of the recovery period. So we compared within each recovery intervention. And therefore we used 32 silver-silver chloride electrodes, which were placed on the heads of the subjects. And after all the pre-processing steps, we applied discrete Fourier transform to conduct frequency analysis. And we also applied the brain imaging technique, standardized low-resolution brain electromagnetic tomography. And the question was not simply, has change occurred, but is there change? And if so, where does these changes occur? And one of our major results was that after post-exercise cold water immersion, subjects were able to maintain a high power output, which is presented in blue. And after passive rest and active recovery, subjects had to significantly reduce the power output in the middle part of the second time trial. When we looked at the effect of high-intensity cycling on the brain, we found some alterations within the beta frequency band at prefrontal and motor electrodes. And when we applied our brain imaging technique, then we found reduced brain activity within the majority of brain areas, and this is reflected in the colors blue. When we determined the effect of recovery on the brain, we found that exercise induces alterations within beta, in the beta frequency band, and cold water immersion at least partly restored the exercise-induced altered beta oscillations, in contrast to passive rest and active recovery. When we looked at our brain imaging data, then we found increased activity within somatosensory information processing centers, the supramarginal gyrus, which is also one of the active brain areas during cognitive functioning and attentional tasks. And we also found a higher activity within the posterior margin of the insular cortex. And this was also outlined in this session of Andreas this morning. So we didn't find a difference in the duration of the second time trial performance between passive rest and active recovery, nor we didn't find a difference in pacing profile. However, cold water immersion not only rapidly reduces physiological parameters, it also showed a different pacing profile. And this is in line with some previous experiments that induced a pre-cooling intervention, and they also found a higher power output compared to the passive rest group. And this different pacing profile is in line with some previous experiments that were performed by the colleagues of the Australian Institute of Sports. They also found an aerogenic effect of cold water immersion on subsequent 30-35 minutes of cycling performance. And the underlying mechanisms are the hydrostatic pressure of water, which increases the transportation of fluids and substrates from the periphery to the central cavity. And the second mechanism is the cold stimulus, which induces peripheral vasoconstriction and also increases the central blood flow. And so both mechanisms reduces the stress on the cardiovascular system. So we also found that when you exercise, there is an altered relative power spectrum, and we found reduced beta-1 power at the prefrontal cortex, which is in line with studies, experiments from Nielsen. And when we look at our brain mapping, we found reduced brain activity within the majority of brain areas. And this actually adds support for a reduced central drive related to exercising in the heat. And this might be due to a reduced cerebral blood flow that has been shown during exercising in the heat. But this result might also be due to a higher state of relaxation after high-intensity exercise in the preferred sport. When we look or focus on the recovery results or the effect of recovery on the brain, we didn't find any electrocortical alteration at any frequency range during active recovery and passive rest. However, cold water immersion returns exercise-induced altered brain oscillations to pre-exercise levels. So we didn't only found some difference within the periphery, but also within the brain. And this is in line with previous experiments that induced passive heating in rats and exercise-induced hyperthermia in human subjects. They also found alterations within higher EEG frequency ranges. They also found a return to baseline levels when cooling was applied. And cold water immersion increased the brain activity in the somatosensory information processing center supramarginal gyrus and also the posterior margin of the insular cortex. And this is also in line with some previous experiments that induced cooling stimuli and the brain imaging technique, positron emission tomography. So to conclude, after cold water immersion, subjects were able to maintain a high power output during subsequent time trial performance. And this adds support to cool an athlete after high-intensity exercise in the heat. And when you cycle in the heat, there are some alterations within the brain at prefrontal and motor cortices. And we also found reduced activity within the majority of brain areas. Post-exercise cold water immersion restored exercise-induced altered brain oscillations to pre-exercise levels and also showed a higher activity within somatosensory information processing centers. I would like to end with a quote. It is not all about recovery, but recovery makes the difference. Thanks.
First of all, I would like to, our recovery is important, so I'll sit down here. First of all, I would like to congratulate anybody who can do a study with EEG should be congratulated. That's very hard to do, especially in the heat, because subjects sweat, so that's nice. Any questions from the audience? There's one from Sebastian. And meanwhile, I may say that the idea that it is due to the reduction in cerebral blood flow, I wouldn't do that. I would look at a paper that we published in, I think it was 2004, where we actually restored cerebral blood flow, and we still saw that the EEG signal, the power spectrum of the beta was down.
Thank you. I think I should associate my felicitation to the one of Lars to be able to do a study on EEG. We have been trying that, and we are struggling with doing some EEG in the heat. My question is, I was wondering, did you look at some EEG asymmetry using your brain mapping data? There is some report suggesting that the left to right EEG activity ratio is an index of withdrawal or an index of motivation.
The ratio of, I'm sorry.
Left to versus right activity.
We didn't look at all to the asymmetry. We only looked at the whole EEG dataset. So yeah, we didn't make the comparisons. That's indeed an interesting topic also.